Route 103, October 2005, New Hampshire Day 1. The van's engine coughed like a dying smoker as June Talbot pressed her face to the window, watching the pine trees blur past in endless green walls. Route 103 stretched ahead, cracked asphalt disappearing into shadow, yellow lines faded to ghosts. She'd driven this road once before, 16 years ago, following an ambulance that carried what was left of her Uncle David. "Everyone doing okay back there?" The driver, Marcus Webb, called over his shoulder. He was maybe 45, with the kind of beard that suggested he'd given up on society sometime in the 90s. His business card read Wilderness Survival Experiences in Comic Sans font, not exactly confidence-inspiring. June shifted in her seat, studying the other passengers. 7 total, all strangers who'd answered the same Craigslist ad, unplug from the world. 7 days, no phones, no internet, no safety net. Learn what you're really made of. The woman beside her, Elena Reeves, clutched a worn paperback copy of Into the Wild. Mid-30s, wedding ring gone but the tan line still visible. Running from something just like the rest of them. "How much further?" asked the kid in the back, Tommy something. College-aged, probably signed up to impress a girlfriend who'd already dumped him. "Another 20 minutes, Marcus said. "We're heading to an old mining settlement. Been abandoned since the 40s, but the cabins are still standing, mostly." June's hands found her medical bag, force of habit. As a trauma nurse at Mass General, she never traveled without supplies. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking wilderness therapy in the same woods where her uncle had died in that mysterious crash. David Talbot, 34, found 3 days later, wrapped around a pine tree on a road he'd driven 1,000 times. No alcohol in his system, no medical issues, perfect weather, just gone. The van turned onto a dirt road so rough it felt like driving through a paint mixer. Through the trees, June caught glimpses of rusted machinery, concrete foundations, swallowed by moss, and the dark mouth of a mine shaft sealed with rotting boards. "Welcome to Blackstone Hollow," Marcus announced as they rolled into a clearing. "You're home for the next week." The camp consisted of 4 cabins arranged in a rough square around a fire pit. The structures looked like they'd been abandoned, reclaimed by nature, then hastily patched with new boards and corrugated metal. Solar panels glinted on one roof, the only concession to the modern world. June stepped out of the van, breathing air so clean it made her city lungs ache. The silence was absolute except for wind through pine needles and something else, a low humming. That might have been insects or might have been power lines, though she saw none. "First rule," Marcus said, unloading their gear. "We stay above the tree line after sundown. These mountains have peculiarities. Bears, mostly, but other things too. Old mine shafts, unstable ground. The darkness up here isn't like city dark. It's got teeth." He pointed to a ridge visible through the canopy. "That's your safety zone. Below it after dark, you're on your own." The group gathered around the fire pit as Marcus continued his orientation. June studied her fellow survivors, Elena with her nervous energy and hidden grief, Tommy trying too hard to look outdoorsy. In brand new hiking gear, an older man named Frank Kozlowski who moved like he'd seen combat, a quiet woman in her 40s, called Sarah Chen, a heavyset guy named Pete Garrison who kept checking his phone for non-existent signal, and finally, Diane Morrison, a brittle woman in expensive athleisure who'd probably never been more than 10 feet from a Starbucks. "Second rule," Marcus said. "Don't split up after dark, ever. I don't care if you're just going to take a piss, bring a buddy." Tommy raised his hand like he was still in high school. "What about during the day?" "Day's fine. Explore, learn the land, challenge yourself. But when that sun touches the ridge, you stay with the group." "Third rule, if you hear your name called in the woods, especially at night, you don't answer. Sound carries weird up here. Could be an echo from miles away, could be someone in trouble, could be—" He shrugged. "Just don't answer." Frank leaned forward, scarred hands clasped together. "What kind of could be? Mountain folk have stories. Probably bullshit, but why take chances?" "Fourth rule, nobody leaves before day 7. I don't care if you're homesick, scared, or bored. 7 days, like we agreed. I've got your emergency contacts, your car keys, everything. Consider yourselves committed." Pete held up his dead phone. "What if there's a real emergency? There's a satellite phone in my cabin for true life or death situations. But ask yourself, how often has something happened that couldn't wait 7 days? Besides disconnection anxiety, I mean. June thought about the hospital, her patients, the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. 7 days off the grid felt like 7 years. But maybe that was the point. Maybe that's what she needed. Last rule, Marcus said, his voice dropping. Stay out of the mine. That's not part of the retreat. It's dangerous, it's posted, and it's got nothing to do with survival training. We're here to learn about ourselves, not explore holes in the ground. As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted from the trees, a low groan. Like metal under stress, or maybe something larger taking a breath. Everyone turned toward it, but the forest revealed nothing. Just settling, Marcus said quickly. Old mining equipment, the mountains always shifting. They spent the afternoon setting up camp and learning basic skills, water, purification, shelter building, fire starting without matches. June found herself partnered with Elena, who proved surprisingly capable despite her obvious anxiety. You seem to know what you're doing, Elena said as June demonstrated how to split kindling. My uncle taught me. Long time ago. June kept her voice neutral. She hadn't told anyone why she was really here, why she'd driven 4 hours to the same stretch of forest where David had died. Sometimes trauma nurses needed their own trauma therapy, but this felt more like confrontation than healing. Where was that? Up here, actually. These same woods. Elena paused, her hands stilling on the rope she was braiding. Really? My father used to work up here, in the mines before they closed. He died when I was 12. Something cold moved through June's chest when 1989 October, Elena's voice was barely a whisper. Car accident on Route 103. They said he was driving too fast, but Dad was the most careful person I knew. Never even got a speeding ticket. June's hands trembled. She set down her knife and stared at Elena. What was your father's name? Robert Reeves. Why? The forest seemed to hold its breath. My uncle died the same night, same road. David Talbot. Elena went very still. October 15th? Yeah. They stared at each other as the implications sank in. 2 families, 2 deaths, same night, same road, and now their daughters, drawn to the same wilderness survival course in the same woods 16 years later. Elena shook her head. That's impossible. A coincidence. But June was already thinking like a nurse, looking for patterns, connections, causes. Have you ever been back here before? Never. I swore I wouldn't. But after my divorce, I needed... She gestured at the forest around them. Something real, something that would test me. Same, June lied. She'd come here because she couldn't stop dreaming about David's voice calling her name in the dark. Because 16 years of trauma nursing had taught her that some wounds never heal. They just wait. That evening, they gathered around the campfire sharing stories and MREs that tasted like salted cardboard. The conversation flowed easier than expected. City stress, failed relationships. The hunger for something authentic in a digital world. Even Diane seemed to relax, admitting she'd never slept without a noise machine. I keep waiting for sirens, June said. In Boston, there's always sirens. Here it's so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat. Frank poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the darkness. Quiet can be good. Quiet means nobody's shooting at you. Military? Tommy asked. Gulf War. First one. Learned real quick that silence is golden. Frank's eyes reflected the flames, though sometimes silence means something's hunting. A log shifted in the fire, and for a moment June thought she heard something else, a whisper at the edge of perception, like her name being called from very far away. She looked around the circle, but everyone else seemed focused on Frank's story. What kind of hunting? Pete asked. Doesn't matter. Point is, you learn to listen. Really listen. Most people live their whole lives with noise canceling out their instincts. Frank looked up at the canopy above them. Up here, your instincts might keep you alive. They talked until the fire burned low, then retreated to their cabins. June shared hers with Elena and Sarah, who'd barely said 10 words all day. The bunks were rough-hewn logs with thin mattresses that smelled like pine sap and mouse droppings. June lay awake listening to the forest breathe around them. In the distance, she could hear the others settling in. Pete snoring from the men's cabin, Diane's muttered complaints from across the clearing. Normal sounds of people adjusting to roughing it. But underneath, something else, a rhythmic creaking like rope under tension, or old floorboards bearing weight. She checked her watch, 2:47 a.m. Outside their window, the trees swayed in a wind she couldn't feel. David? The thought came unbidden. For just a moment, she'd almost expected to see him standing at the edge of the clearing, beckoning her toward the dark trees. June closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the creaking continued until dawn. Day 2. June woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Marcus cooking breakfast over the fire pit. The morning sun slanted through the pines, turning the clearing golden and driving away the previous night's unease. In daylight, everything looked smaller, more manageable. "Sleep well?" Elena asked, already dressed and braiding her hair. "Like the dead," June said, then immediately regretted the phrase. They joined the others around the fire. Pete looked like he'd wrestled with his sleeping bag all night, while Tommy seemed energized by the whole experience. Diane nursed her coffee like it was medicine. "Today we're learning navigation and foraging," Marcus announced. "Basic orienteering, edible plants, reading the landscape. We'll split into teams of 3 and explore different sections of the area." June found herself grouped with Frank and Tommy. Marcus handed each team a topographical map marked with their assigned areas and basic compass readings. "Remember," he said, "stay within the marked boundaries. There's unstable ground to the east and the mine complex to the north is off limits. Any questions? What's that?" Sarah pointed to a structure visible through the trees, a concrete foundation overgrown with moss and saplings. "Old company housing, been empty for 60 years. Most of the buildings are gone, but the foundations remain. Good place to practice reading terrain features." They set off in different directions. June's team headed west toward a series of ridges Marcus had marked as good vantage points. The hiking was moderate but steady, and June found herself breathing hard within the first hour. City living had not prepared her for this. "You okay?" Frank asked. Despite being at least 50, he moved through the forest like he belonged there. "Just out of shape," June gasped. Tommy, of course, was barely winded. "This is awesome. I mean, when do you get to disconnect like this? No texts, no emails, no constant noise." They crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a valley June recognized from the maps she'd studied before coming. Route 103 cut through it like a scar, visible as a thin line through the canopy. Somewhere down there, 16 years ago, her uncle had driven off the road for no reason anyone could determine. "Beautiful country," Frank said, settling on a boulder to rest. "Hard to believe people used to live and work up here." June pulled out her water bottle and tried to spot the crash site, but the forest had reclaimed everything. "What do you think happened to them? The miners?" "Same thing that always happens. Company found cheaper operations elsewhere. Ore played out. Towns died. Story of industrial America." Frank studied the valley below them. "Though I heard this place had other problems." Tommy perked up. "Like what?" "Cave-ins, mostly. The mountain's full of limestone. Water gets in, washes out the supporting rock. Whole sections collapse. Lost a dozen men in 1943 when a tunnel system flooded." June felt something cold in her chest. "How do you know all this?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather worked these mines before the war. He used to tell stories. What was his name?" The question came out sharper than June intended. "Stanley Kozlowski. Why?" June's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. Dead, of course, but she'd loaded it with photos before coming. Family pictures, including one from David's funeral. She scrolled through the stored images until she found it. A group. Shot of the miners who died in the 1989 crash. There, third from the right, Stanley Kozlowski, 1943 to 1989. "Frank," she said slowly, "I think we need to talk." She showed him the photo. Frank went very pale, staring at the image of his grandfather, much younger than Frank had ever known him, but unmistakably the same man. "This was taken the day before the crash," June said. "October 14th, 1989. Your grandfather was working with my uncle on some kind of mining survey. They were part of a crew trying to assess the old tunnels for potential reopening." Frank sat down heavily. That's impossible. Grandpa died in Florida. Nursing home. I was at the funeral." "When?" 2 months after this photo was supposedly taken. December 1989. June felt the world tilt slightly. "Frank, I think someone's been lying to both of us." They spent the next hour comparing stories. Frank's grandfather had supposedly been in declining health, living in a Miami facility for dementia patients. But the records June had seen, police reports, news articles, clearly listed Stanley. Kozlowski among the missing after the Route 103 incident. 3 dead, 4 missing, June recited. "My Uncle David was one of the dead. Your grandfather was one of the missing, along with Robert Reeves, Elena's father, and 2 others, Pete Garrison Sr. and Chen Wei-Ming." Frank stared at her. "Pete? That Pete? And Sarah's last name is Chen." The implications hung between them like smoke. 3 generations, all connected to the same tragedy, all drawn to the same. Wilderness survival course in the same location 16 years later. We need to get back, June said. We need to compare notes with the others. But when they returned to camp, they found chaos. Elena was pacing by the fire pit, tears streaming down her face. Sarah sat on a log, pale and shaking. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. What happened? June asked. Pete's gone, Elena said. We went exploring east of camp, toward those old foundations. Pete said he needed to take a leak, went behind some trees. That was 3 hours ago. Frank checked his watch. It's only been 2 hours since we separated. No, Sarah spoke for the first time all day, her voice barely audible. Time moves differently here. Haven't you noticed? Watch the shadows. June looked up. The sun seemed wrong, too high for late afternoon, but the shadows were, long and dark, pointing in directions that didn't match the light. Diane emerged from her cabin, looking haggard. Something's not right about this place. I keep hearing voices, and my compass is spinning like a top. Tommy pulled out his own compass and swore. The needle rotated slowly, continuously, never settling on magnetic north. Where's Marcus? June asked. Don't know, Elena said. He left this morning after we split up. Said he had to check something at the mine. Frank stood up, his military bearing taking over. Okay, let's think about this logically. People don't just vanish. Pete probably got turned around, maybe fell into a ravine or old foundation. We need to organize a search. But even as he spoke, June noticed something that made her blood freeze. On the ground near the fire pit, partially hidden by pine needles, was a rusted piece of metal. She knelt and brushed it clean. A license plate. New Hampshire, 1989. The numbers read, 103 BN. Guys, she said quietly, I think we need to talk, all of us, right now. They gathered in a tight circle as June laid out everything, the connections between their families, the 1989 crash, the impossible timing of their presence here. As she spoke, the others' faces went through the same progression: disbelief, recognition, fear. So someone planned this, Diane said when June finished. Someone wanted us here. But who? Tommy asked. And why? Sarah finally spoke up, her voice stronger now. My father used to have nightmares about the mine. He'd wake up screaming about being trapped underground, about voices calling his name. This was years before he disappeared. Elena, Frank said gently, what do you remember about your father's last days? Elena wiped her eyes. He was obsessed with this area. He'd drive up here on weekends, said he was fishing, but he never brought home any fish. And he kept talking about making things right, about debts that needed to be paid. June felt the pieces clicking together like bones snapping into place. They were all involved in something. Our relatives. Something that happened in those mines. The flood, Frank said slowly. Grandpa used to mention it, but never in detail. Said some things were better left buried. Tommy had been quiet, staring at the license plate. Now he looked up with an expression that was far older than his years. My last name isn't really what I told you. It's Garrison. Pete Garrison, Jr. My dad was one of the missing. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. So we're all here, June said finally. All the children, all the relatives, brought together by, what, coincidence? Diane laughed bitterly. There's no such thing as coincidence. Not like this. As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed from the forest, a long, mournful call that might have been human or might have been wind through stone. They all turned toward it, but the trees revealed nothing. That sounded like, Elena began, like someone calling for help, Frank finished. June stood up, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she was a nurse. When people called for help, she answered. We need to find Pete. No, Diane said firmly. We need to get the hell out of here. Right now. With what? Tommy asked. Marcus has our keys, remember? And no cell service. Frank was already moving, gathering supplies from the cabins. Then we walk. Follow the road back to civilization. But when they reached the edge of camp where the dirt road should have been, they found only forest. Pine trees stretched in every direction, with no sign of the path they'd driven in on. This is wrong, Elena whispered. The road was right here. June pulled out her compass, but like the others, the needles spun aimlessly. The shadows continued their impossible dance, and somewhere in the distance the calling continued, closer now, and definitely human. June, it said. June, where are you? Her uncle's voice, exactly as she remembered it. Day 3, they spent the night barricaded in one cabin, taking shifts to watch the darkness. June couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the voice calling her name. It had continued until dawn, sometimes near, sometimes distant, always familiar. When morning came, it brought no relief. The sun felt wrong, too red, too low, casting shadows that moved independently of the light, and Pete was still missing. "We need to find him," June said, over their breakfast of cold MREs and paranoia. "Why?" Diane asked. "So whatever got him can get us too." "Because he's one of us," Frank said quietly, "and because running didn't work yesterday. They'd tried." After discovering the road had vanished, they'd attempted to hike out through the forest. But every path led them in circles, every compass bearing brought them back to camp. It was as if the mountains themselves were a maze designed to keep them trapped. "There has to be an explanation," Tommy said. He'd aged a decade overnight, the college kid enthusiasm replaced by hollow-eyed determination. Magnetic anomalies from the mining operations, maybe. Or we're suffering from some kind of group psychosis brought on by isolation and stress. Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Group psychosis doesn't explain the license plate, or the fact that we're all connected to the same incident. "Then what does explain it?" Elena demanded. June had been thinking about that all night. As a trauma nurse, she'd learned to look for patterns, to find the logical thread connecting seemingly random symptoms. What if it's not supernatural at all? What if someone's been planning this for years? Frank nodded slowly. "A long con... someone with a grudge against our families. But who? And why wait 16 years? Before anyone could answer, they heard it, a voice calling from the forest, weak and desperate. "Help. Somebody help me." Pete. Frank grabbed his pack and a makeshift weapon, a heavy branch he'd been sharpening. "That's him. That's definitely him." June checked her medical supplies. If Pete was injured, he'd need immediate care. "We go together. Nobody gets separated." They followed the voice deeper into the forest, past the rusted mining equipment and crumbling foundations. The trees grew thicker, older, their canopy blocking most of the sun. The air smelled of decay and something else, metallic, like old blood. "Over here," Pete's voice called, weaker now. "Please, I'm hurt." They pushed through a wall of undergrowth and found themselves in a clearing dominated by the dark mouth of a mine shaft. Warning signs in multiple languages surrounded it, but the boards meant to seal the entrance had been torn away from the inside. "Pete?" June called out. His voice echoed from the tunnel. "Down here. Fell. Can't get out." Frank shined his flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed rough-hewn stone walls disappearing into black depths. And there, perhaps 50 feet down, a figure lying motionless on the tunnel floor. "Jesus," Tommy whispered. "How did he fall that far and survive?" June was already rigging a rope system using climbing gear from Marcus's supplies. As a nurse, she'd done emergency rappelling training for helicopter rescues. "I'm going down." "No," Frank said. "I should go. I've got military training, and I've got medical training. If he's injured, every second counts." Elena grabbed June's arm. What if this is a trap? What if something's mimicking his voice? The question hung in the air like smoke. But from below, Pete groaned in pain, a sound June had heard 1,000 times in the trauma bay. Authentic human suffering. "Then we'll deal with it," she said, and rappelled into the mine. The descent felt endless. The walls pressed close, carved stone giving way to natural limestone riddled with strange formations. Her flashlight beam danced across crystals that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. She reached the bottom and found Pete unconscious but breathing. Multiple lacerations, possible concussion, but alive. As she checked his vitals, her light swept across the tunnel walls and she froze. Scratches in the stone. Deep gouges that looked like claw marks, but far too large for any animal. And beneath them, carved into the rock in crude letters, "They came back for us." "Pete," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Pete, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with difficulty. "June, where am I? You're in the mine. Do you remember falling?" Pete struggled to sit up, wincing. "I didn't fall. I was exploring those foundations, and I heard my father's voice. He was calling me, telling me to come home. So I followed it, and it led me to this entrance." June's blood chilled. "Your father's been dead for 16 years, Pete. I know that. But it was his voice. I'd know it anywhere." Pete's eyes were wide, frightened. "June, I think they're all here. All of them. The ones who went missing." Before she could respond, her radio crackled. Frank's voice from above. "June, you need to get out of there. Now. What's wrong?" "We found something. In the mining office. Records, documents." June, our families weren't just involved in surveying the mines. They were part of some kind of cover-up. June helped Pete to his feet, testing his injuries. Bruised but mobile. What kind of cover-up? Static. Then Frank's voice again, more urgent. The flood in 1943. It wasn't an accident. They sealed men alive down there, Pete. 12 miners trapped in the lower tunnels. And our relatives, they knew. They were part of the crew that sealed the entrance. The implications hit June like a physical blow. Mass murder, covered up for decades. And their families had been complicit. We need to get out of here, she told Pete. But as they moved toward the rope, something shifted in the darkness behind them. A sound like breathing, but too deep, too slow for human lungs. June's flashlight caught movement, a figure standing in the tunnel mouth watching them. She blinked, and it was gone. Did you see that? Pete whispered. June keyed her radio. Frank, lower another rope. Fast, no response, just static. They climbed the rope together, Pete moving slowly but steadily. June could feel something watching from the depths below, patient and predatory. When they reached the surface, they found the others huddled around. A pile of documents Frank had retrieved from a collapsed building. Look at this, Elena said, holding up a yellowed report. October 1943. Cave-in at the lower levels. 12 men trapped. The company report says they attempted rescue operations, but... She flipped to another page. The real report. The one marked classified. They decided it was too expensive, sealed the tunnels and left them to die. Sarah was crying silently, reading through personnel files. My grandfather, he was the shift supervisor. He signed the order. Same with mine, Frank said grimly. And according to this, they all came back in 1989 to... What? Reopen the tunnels? June took the files, scanning them with growing horror. They were trying to retrieve the bodies. After 46 years, some kind of corporate liability issue. Families were threatening to sue, wanted proof their relatives were really dead. Tommy found another document, this one more recent. But they found more than bodies down there. Listen to this. Anomalous formations in lower tunnels. Crystalline structures of unknown composition. Recommend immediate geological survey. They found something, Pete said slowly. Something that had been growing down there all those years. Elena pulled out a map showing the mine's layout. Look at this. The lower tunnels connect to a natural cave system that runs for miles underground. The report says some of the formations showed signs of movement. June studied the map, tracing the tunnel networks with her finger. What if they weren't just sealed in? What if they changed, adapted? Frank shook his head. That's impossible. People don't just evolve. No, Sarah said quietly. But they might survive. And after decades trapped in the dark, eating what? Drinking contaminated groundwater, breathing limestone dust, slowly going insane. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Diane had been silent through all of this, but now she looked up from the documents with pure terror in her eyes. There's something else, a list of names, children and relatives of the men who sealed the tunnels. It's dated last month, and it has all our names on it. June took the paper, her hands shaking. There they were. June Talbot, Elena Reeves, Frank Kozlowski, Pete Garrison Jr., Sarah Chen, Tommy Garrison, Diane Morrison. 7 names. 7 people brought together for a wilderness survival course that was never really about survival at all. Someone's been planning this, Frank said. Someone who knows what our families did. Or something, Pete added quietly. Something that's been waiting down there for revenge. As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed from the forest. Voices calling, multiple voices, all familiar. Parents, grandparents, uncles, all the dead, calling their descendants home. And this time the voices were getting closer. Day 4. The voices had called all night. June huddled with the others in the main cabin, listening to her Uncle David's voice drift through the walls like smoke. Sometimes he sounded like he was right outside the door. Sometimes he seemed to be calling from miles away, but always he was asking her to come home. We can't stay here, Diane whispered. She'd been awake for 36 hours straight, her expensive athleisure now torn and dirty. They're getting closer. Elena checked her watch, one of the few timepieces still working correctly. It's almost dawn. They only call at night. How can you be sure? Tommy asked. His hands shook as he cleaned his glasses for the 100th time. How can we be sure of anything anymore? Frank had been studying the mining documents by flashlight, trying to piece together the timeline. According to these reports, the 1989 survey team broke through into the sealed tunnels on October 14th. That's the day before the crash. June looked up from her medical supplies. She'd been taking inventory obsessively, as if counting bandages could somehow prepare her for what was coming. What did they find down there? The bodies weren't right. The report mentions significant decomposition anomalies and unexpected preservation in certain areas. But here's the weird part. Some of the sealed tunnels showed signs of recent excavation. From the inside, Sarah had barely spoken since reading about her grandfather's involvement, but now she lifted her head. They were trying to dig out? For 46 years, Frank confirmed. And they might have succeeded. Look at this geological survey from October 10th, 1989. It shows several new openings connecting the sealed areas to the surface. Pete was studying a topographical map, comparing it to the old mining charts. These surface openings, they're all within a 2-mile radius of where we are now. The implications hit June like ice water. They got out. Before our families could finish the survey, they got out. And killed them, Elena added quietly. Caused the crash, made it look like an accident. But 4 of them went missing, Tommy pointed out. Not dead. Missing. Diane laughed hysterically. Don't you get it? They took them, down into the tunnels, kept them alive to, what? Make them pay for what they did? The cabin fell silent except for the wind through the pine needles outside. Somewhere in that sound, June thought she heard whispers, her name mixed with promises and threats in her uncle's voice. Frank set down the documents and picked up his improvised spear. We need to find Marcus. He might have answers. Marcus brought us here, Sarah said. He's part of this. Then we need to find out who he really is and what he wants. June stood up, decision crystallizing in her mind. I'm going back to the mine. Are you insane? Diane shrieked. I'm a trauma nurse. I deal with emergencies by getting more information, not less. June checked her medical kit, making sure she had everything she might need. Something's keeping us here. Something in those tunnels. If we want out, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Frank nodded slowly. Military logic. Know your enemy. I'll go with you, Elena said. No, too dangerous. My father's down there, Elena said firmly. If there's even a chance he's still alive. Pete struggled to his feet, still moving carefully from his injuries. Count me in. My dad, too. Within an hour, they'd organized an expedition. June, Elena, Frank, and Pete would explore the mine while Tommy, Sarah, and Diane remained at camp. They'd maintain radio contact and return before sunset, no matter what they found. The mine entrance looked different in daylight, less like a mouth and more like a wound in the mountainside. The warning signs had been supplemented with newer postings: danger, unstable ground, and authorized personnel only. Marcus's work, Frank observed, noting the fresh mounting hardware. They descended carefully, using proper climbing equipment this time. The upper tunnel was exactly as June remembered. Rough stone walls carved by long-dead miners, but essentially normal. It was only when they reached the lower levels that things became strange. The air grew thick and humid despite the cool temperature. Condensation dripped from formations that looked more grown than carved. And everywhere the walls showed signs of modification, smooth patches where rough stone had been worn away by decades of contact. This doesn't look like mining damage, Elena whispered, running her hand along one of the smooth sections. It's too organic. Frank's flashlight illuminated side tunnels branching off in impossible directions. According to the maps, there should only be 3 main passages at this level. I count at least 7. They followed the main tunnel deeper into the mountain, their flashlight, beams dancing across walls that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The silence was complete except for the sound of their breathing and the steady drip of water from unseen sources. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they found the first evidence of the original. Disaster. A wall of collapsed stone and timber that had once sealed the lower tunnels. But it had been torn open from the inside. Massive chunks of limestone scattered like toys. Jesus, Pete whispered, staring at the destruction. What could do this? Frank examined the rubble. This wasn't done with tools. Look at the edges. They're worn smooth, like they were clawed away over decades. Beyond the breach, the tunnel opened into a vast natural cavern. Their lights couldn't reach the ceiling or far walls, but the space felt enormous. And everywhere, covering the floor and walls like a carpet, were bones. Thousands of them. Not just the 12 miners from 1943, but animals, birds, and other things June couldn't identify. All picked clean and arranged in careful patterns that spoke of intelligence, purpose, ritual. Elena grabbed June's arm. Those aren't all human bones. June knelt beside a skull that was clearly human but wrong somehow. Elongated, with too many teeth. Another showed signs of deliberate modification, holes drilled in precise locations. They've been changing, adapting. In the center of the bone field stood a structure that might once have been an altar. On it lay 7 objects: a nurse's cap, a wedding ring, a military medal, a college ID, a mining helmet, a child's toy truck, and a woman's watch. All recent, all familiar. Our things, Pete said in horror. Those are our things. June picked up the nurse's cap, hers, taken from her bag sometime in the past 3 days. They've been in our camp, going through our stuff. Frank was studying the arrangement with military precision. This is a message, or a threat, or an invitation, Elena said quietly. From somewhere in the darkness beyond their lights came a sound like breathing, but wrong. Too deep, too wet, too deliberate. Multiple sets of lungs moving in synchronization. June keyed her radio. "Tommy, do you copy?" Static. Then Tommy's panicked voice. "June, thank God. You need to get back here now. What's wrong?" "Sarah's gone. We found her cabin empty, bed not slept in, and there are tracks leading into the forest. Lots of tracks." Frank was already moving toward the tunnel entrance. "We're coming up." But as they turned to leave, their flashlights caught movement in the shadows. Figures standing at the edge of the bone field. Tall, wrong, but recognizably once human. Watching them with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. One of them stepped forward, and in the wavering beam of June's flashlight, she saw her Uncle David. 16 years older, changed by decades underground, but unmistakably him. His clothes were rotted rags, his skin pale as limestone, and when he smiled, his teeth were sharp as needles. "Hello, June," he said in a voice like gravel grinding. "I've been waiting for you to come home. Day 5, they ran." June had seen trauma, had witnessed every kind of human damage and degradation, but the thing that wore her uncle's face was something her mind simply refused to process. They scrambled up the tunnel in blind panic, flashlight beams dancing wildly off stone walls as something followed them, breathing, scraping, calling their names in voices they'd once loved. When they burst from the mine entrance into gray daylight, they found chaos at the camp. Tommy was barricaded in the main cabin, shouting updates through the radio. Diane sat by the cold fire pit, rocking back and forth and laughing softly. "Where's Sarah?" Frank demanded. Diane looked up at them with eyes that had seen too much. She went to find her father, said she could hear him calling from the forest. That was 4 hours ago. Tommy emerged from the cabin, clutching a shotgun June hadn't seen before. "I found this in Marcus's supplies, along with these." He held up a bundle of photographs, surveillance shots of each of them taken over the past several months. At work, at home, going about their normal lives. "Someone's been watching us," Elena said unnecessarily. June took the photos, studying them. "Not someone. Marcus, he's been planning this for months." Frank examined the shotgun, checking the action. "Where did he go?" "Marcus? Don't know," Tommy said. "His cabin's been empty since yesterday. But I found something else." He led them to a storage shed they'd assumed was locked. Inside, camping gear, survival supplies, and a detailed dossier on each of them. Personal information, family histories, psychological profiles. Elena read from her file with growing horror. Subject shows signs of unresolved grief regarding father's death, likely to respond to auditory hallucinations mimicking paternal voice. Recommended approach, isolation, stress, gradual psychological breakdown. "We're experiments," Pete said flatly. "Lab rats in a maze." June was studying a map pinned to the shed wall, a detailed layout of the mine system with notations in red ink. Not experiments, bait. The map showed not just the historical mine shafts, but dozens of new tunnels radiating out from the central complex. All of them led to surface openings marked with dates, some as recent as last week. They've been expanding, Frank realized. The things down there, they've been digging new ways to the surface. And Marcus has been helping them, June added. Or working with them. "Look at this." She pointed to a notation near one of the surface openings. "Primary delivery scheduled October 15th, 2005. 7 subjects confirmed. Today's date." Diane's laughter became hysterical. "Delivery. We're a delivery, like pizza." A gunshot echoed from the forest, distant but unmistakable. They all turned toward the sound, and Tommy raised the shotgun. "Sarah?" Elena called out. No response, but something else was moving through the trees. Multiple shapes, staying just out of sight but clearly surrounding the camp. "Inside," Frank ordered. "Everyone inside now." They barricaded themselves in the main cabin, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. Through the gaps in the boards, June could see movement in the forest, pale figures that walked upright but moved wrong, like marionettes with tangled strings. "The radio," Tommy said suddenly. Marcus's satellite phone. If we can get to his cabin. It's 50 yards, Frank said. Might as well be 50 miles. June was thinking like a nurse again, analyzing the situation clinically. They're not attacking. They're waiting for something. For what? Before she could answer, they heard a voice from outside. Clear, human, familiar. Marcus, calling from somewhere near the fire pit. I know you're in there. I know you're scared. But it doesn't have to be this way. Frank crept to a window, peering through the boards. I see him. He's alone. Or he appears to be alone, Elena corrected. Marcus continued talking. Your family's made a choice in 1943. They sealed those tunnels knowing men were alive down there. 12 men who died slowly, in the dark, forgotten by everyone who could have saved them. June pressed her face to the window. Marcus stood by the fire pit, looking completely normal. No visible weapons, no obvious threat. But something was wrong with his shadow. It moved independently, reaching toward the cabin while Marcus stood still. They adapted, Marcus continued. 46 years underground, they learned to survive in ways that would amaze Darwin. And when your families came back in 1989, they were ready. Pete grabbed the radio. What happened to them? What happened to our parents? Marcus smiled, and for a moment his teeth seemed too sharp. They're still here, Pete. They never left. Would you like to see them? The forest around the camp began to move. Figures emerged from between the trees, a dozen or more, walking slowly toward the cabin. In the gray afternoon light, June could make out faces she recognized from old family photos. Her Uncle David, Elena's father Robert, Pete's dad, Sarah's grandfather, all changed, all wrong, but undeniably them. They've been waiting, Marcus said. 16 years, they've been patient. But now it's time for the next generation to pay the debt. Elena was crying, staring at her father through the window. Daddy? Robert Reeves turned toward her voice, his movements jerky and unnatural. When he spoke, his voice was like wind through stone. Elena, my little girl. Come home, sweetheart. Come home to Daddy. It's not him, June said firmly. Whatever that is, it's not your father. But Elena was already moving toward the door, her hands fumbling with the barricade. He's calling me. I can hear him calling me. Frank grabbed her arms. Elena, stop. Think. Your father's been dead for 16 years. He's not dead. Elena screamed. He's right there. He needs me. She broke free and ran for the door, but Pete tackled her before she could remove the barricade. Outside, the figures pressed closer to the cabin, calling their names in voices that carried love and hunger in equal measure. June forced herself to think rationally. As a trauma nurse, she'd seen people in extreme psychological distress. Elena was having a breakdown, but that didn't make the situation any less real. We need to get to that radio. Call for help. From who? Tommy asked. And tell them what? I don't know, but we can't stay here. Frank was studying the positions of the figures outside. They're arranged in a pattern, like they're herding us toward something. June looked at the map again, noting the positions of the surface openings. The mine. They want us to go back to the mine. Why? Marcus answered as if he'd heard the question. Because that's where the debt gets paid. That's where the cycle completes. 12 men died down there because of your family's choices. Now 12 descendants will take their place. There's only 7 of us, Pete called out. Sarah makes 8, Marcus replied. And there are others coming. This was just the first group. The implications hit June like a physical blow. He's done this before. Other families, other descendants. How many people has he brought here? Through the window she could see more figures emerging from the forest. Not just their relatives now, but others. Men and women in the rotted remains of clothes from different eras. Some looked like they'd been dead for decades. Others were more recent. All the children, Marcus said dreamily. All the grandchildren, all the relatives. We'd been very thorough, very patient. Elena had stopped struggling, but her eyes were fixed on her father's figure with desperate longing. He looks the same, exactly the same as the day he died. Because he didn't die, Marcus explained. None of them died. They just went underground. They adapted. They learned. And now they're ready to welcome their families home. June made a decision. As a trauma nurse, she'd learned that sometimes the only way forward was through the crisis. We're going to make a run for Marcus's cabin. Get to that radio. Call for help. Are you crazy? Diane whispered. We can't stay here, and we can't go to the mine, so we go for the radio. Frank nodded grimly. I'll cover you. But we move fast, and we move together. June looked around at her companions. Elena lost in grief and longing, Pete. Injured and pale, Tommy barely holding together. Diane catatonic with fear. Not exactly a crack team, but they were what she had. On my count, Frank said, moving to the door. 3, 2, 1. They burst from the cabin like water from a broken dam, running across the clearing toward Marcus's cabin. The figures in the forest turned toward them, moving with sudden, predatory speed. June heard Marcus laughing behind them as they ran. They made it halfway before the first one reached them. Elena screamed as her father grabbed her arm, his grip leaving pale marks on her skin. His touch was cold as stone, and when he smiled, she could see all the way. Down his throat to something that writhed and pulsed in the darkness. "Come home, Elena," he whispered. "Daddy's been waiting." Frank raised the shotgun and fired, the blast echoing across the clearing. The thing that looked like Robert Reeves staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it turned toward Frank with interest, tilting its head like a curious dog. "Bullets won't work," Marcus called out. "They're already dead, have been for years." June grabbed Elena and pulled her toward the cabin as more figures closed in. Pete was limping badly, Tommy pale with shock. They reached Marcus's door to find it locked. Frank kicked it in, and they tumbled inside just as hands began pounding on the walls around them. The satellite phone sat on the table like salvation, and June grabbed it with shaking fingers. No signal. "The antenna," Frank said, pointing to the roof. Someone cut the cable. Outside, the pounding grew louder. Through the window, June could see dozens of figures now, all the missing people from 60 years of mining accidents, all the descendants who'd come before them, an army of the dead and the changed, all focused on the 7 survivors trapped in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. "There has to be another way out," Tommy said desperately. June was studying Marcus's notes, looking for anything useful. "According to this, there's an old mining road that connects to Route 103 about 3 miles north. It's marked as impassable, but it's our only shot," Frank finished. Elena looked up from where she was huddled on the floor. "My father's out there. He wants me to come home." "That's not your father," June said gently. "Your father died 16 years ago. That thing outside is something else wearing his face. How can you be sure?" June thought about all the trauma cases she'd seen, all the families she'd had to comfort. "Because your father loved you, and nothing that loves you would want you to suffer like this." Outside, the voices were calling again, pleading, threatening, promising. But underneath them, June heard something else, a low rumble, like heavy machinery starting up. Marcus's voice cut through the noise. "The mine's opening. Children, all the passages, all the tunnels. It's time to go home. Time to pay the debt your families owe." Through the window, June could see lights moving in the forest. Not flashlights, but something that glowed with its own phosphorescence. The mountain itself seemed to be breathing, exhaling luminous mist through dozens of openings. The whole area is unstable, Frank realized, studying the geological surveys. All this excavation, all these new tunnels, they've undermined the entire mountainside. June felt a plan forming, desperate, probably suicidal, but better than waiting to be dragged underground. What if we don't run? What if we bring the mountain down on them? How? She pointed to a notation on Marcus's map. Primary support beam, Tunnel 7. Structural integrity compromised. We go back to the mine. We find that support beam, and we bring the whole thing down. Elena stared at her. "That's suicide." "Maybe, but it's also the only way to make sure this stops, that no more families get brought here." Frank was nodding slowly. "Controlled collapse. Seal all the tunnels permanently. And us with them," Pete pointed out. June looked around at her companions, broken, terrified, but still alive, still fighting. Better than the alternative. The pounding on the walls stopped suddenly, leaving in silence that felt like held breath. Through the window, June could see the figures retreating into the forest, moving toward the mine entrance. Marcus's voice drifted through the air. "They're waiting for you, all of them. Your families, your ancestors, everyone who came before. They're waiting to welcome you home." June picked up the shotgun and checked the shells. "Then let's not keep them waiting." Day 6. They waited for full darkness before moving. The plan was simple in the way that desperate plans often are. Reach the mine, locate the primary support. Structure Frank had identified on the geological surveys, and collapse the entire tunnel system. Simple, suicidal. Their only option. June checked her medical kit one last time, knowing it was probably pointless. If they succeeded, they wouldn't need bandages. If they failed, bandages wouldn't help. Elena sat in the corner staring at her hands. "I can still hear him calling," she whispered. "Even with them gone, I can hear my father's voice." "It's not real," June said gently. "How do you know?" How can any of us know what's real anymore? It was a fair question. The past 4 days had shattered every assumption June had about reality, about death, about the natural order of things. But her training kicked in. In trauma situations, you focus on what you can control, not what you can't. Because we're still alive, she said. And as long as we're alive, we can choose what comes next. Frank had been studying the mining maps by flashlight, memorizing the route to Tunnel 7. According to these surveys, the support beam is about half a mile into the main shaft. There's a secondary entrance we can use, less likely to be watched. Pete checked his injuries, testing his mobility. How do we bring down a support beam without proper equipment? These old mines used wooden supports, not steel, Frank explained. The beam's been carrying weight for 60 years. A few well-placed charges should do it. We don't have charges. Tommy held up several items from Marcus's supplies: road flares, camp fuel, fertilizer from a gardening kit, improvised explosives. I was pre-med before I switched to engineering, had to take chemistry. June stared at him. You can make a bomb? A very crude one. Big enough to weaken old wood. Tommy's hands shook as he worked, but his voice was steady. The question is whether we can get close enough to plant it. Through the window, the forest glowed with that strange phosphorescent light. Figures moved between the trees, their transformed relatives, Marcus and others June didn't recognize. All of them focused on the mine entrance, waiting. They know we're coming, Diane said. She'd been silent for hours, but her voice was clearer now, as if fear had burned away her hysteria. This is what they want. They want us in those tunnels. Then we give them what they want, June said, and we make sure they regret it. They slipped out through the back window of Marcus's cabin, moving carefully through the darkness. The secondary mine entrance was a narrow shaft cut into the mountainside, partially hidden by undergrowth. According to the maps, it connected to the main tunnel system about a quarter mile from the support beam. The entrance wasn't guarded, but that somehow made it worse. The things in the forest were so confident of success that they didn't bother with sentries. Frank led them into the tunnel, his flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The air grew thick and humid, carrying scents of decay and something else, something organic and alive. Jesus, Pete whispered. The walls are moving. June looked closer and saw he was right. The stone surfaces rippled like water, and in some places she could see veins of something that looked disturbingly like tissue running through the rock. It's not just a mine anymore, Elena said. It's become something else, something alive. They pressed deeper into the mountain, following Frank's memorized route. Side passages branched off in impossible directions, and June caught glimpses of vast chambers filled with that bone-pale light. Sometimes she heard sounds, breathing, scraping, voices whispering in languages she didn't recognize. How much farther? Tommy asked. Frank checked his compass, which spun aimlessly. Maybe another few hundred yards. Hard to tell with the magnetic interference. They rounded a corner and found themselves in a vast natural cathedral, the ceiling lost in darkness above them. And there, in the center of the space, stood the primary support beam, a massive wooden pillar that looked like a tree trunk, carved with symbols June didn't recognize. Around it, arranged in careful patterns, were their missing companions. Sarah sat cross-legged on the stone floor, her eyes closed, humming softly. Marcus stood beside her, no longer pretending to be human. His skin had the pale, translucent quality of something that had lived underground for decades. And surrounding them were the others, all the transformed relatives, all the previous victims, all the children and grandchildren who'd been brought here over the years, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all watching the newcomers with expectant eyes. "Welcome home," Marcus said softly. "We've been waiting for you." Elena took a step forward, drawn by the sight of her father among the crowd. "Daddy." Robert Reeves smiled, his two sharp teeth gleaming in the phosphorescent light. "Hello, sweetheart. Are you ready to come home now?" June grabbed Elena's arm. "Don't listen to him." "But he's my father," Elena protested, tears streaming down her face. "No," June said firmly. "He was your father. Now he's something else." Marcus laughed, the sound echoing through the cathedral space. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about death. It's about evolution, adaptation. Your families left 12 men to die down here in 1943, and those men found a way to survive, to thrive." He gestured to the walls around them, which pulsed with veins of organic matter. They became part of the mountain, part of something greater. And now it's your turn. Frank raised the shotgun, but his hands were shaking. "Stay back. We're armed." "With what?" Bullets? Marcus shook his head. We're beyond bullets now. Beyond death. Beyond everything you understand about life. June was studying the support beam, trying to estimate how Tommy's improvised explosive might affect it. The wood was old, probably dry-rotted in places. A good blast might be enough to bring down this section of the tunnel, but they had to get close enough to plant it first. What do you want from us? She asked, playing for time. The same thing we wanted from your families, Marcus replied. Justice. 12 men died because of their choices. 12 descendants must take their place. It's balance. Natural law. Natural law doesn't include turning people into monsters, Pete said. Marcus tilted his head, considering this. Monster is a relative term. From our perspective, you are the monsters, creatures who live on the surface, poisoning the earth, destroying everything you touch. We've found a better way. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at them with profound sadness. It doesn't hurt, she said softly. Once you let go, once you accept it, it doesn't hurt at all. Elena was moving toward her father again, drawn by some force June couldn't see. Daddy, I've missed you so much. I know, sweetheart, Robert Reeves said gently. I've missed you too, but now we can be together forever. June saw her chance. While everyone's attention was focused on Elena and her father, she signaled to Tommy. He nodded, understanding, and began working his way around the edge of the chamber toward the support beam. Frank saw what they were doing and raised his voice, drawing attention. What happens after? Say you get your 12 descendants, then what? Marcus smiled. Then we expand. The surface world is dying, poisoned by its own excess, but we've learned to live in harmony with the earth itself. We've become part of the ecosystem. By eating people? Frank demanded. By recycling them. Nothing is wasted here. Death is just another form of energy. Elena had reached her father now, and he embraced her with arms that looked almost normal until you noticed the joints bent in impossible directions. That's my girl, he whispered. Now come home with Daddy. Elena, no, June shouted, but it was too late. Elena's eyes rolled back, and when she opened them again, they glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the walls. I understand now, she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. I understand what we have to do. Tommy was almost at the support beam, his improvised explosive ready. But one of the transformed figures, June's Uncle David, stepped into his path. Hello, nephew, David said conversationally. Fancy meeting you here. Tommy froze, staring at the thing that wore his relative's face. In that moment of hesitation, other figures closed in around him. June made a decision. She'd spent her career running toward danger, toward crisis, toward situations where life and death balanced on a knife's edge. This was no different. She pulled the remaining road flares from her pack and lit them all at once, throwing them into the crowd of transformed figures. They recoiled from the bright light, hissing and covering their eyes. Now, she shouted to Frank. Frank opened fire with the shotgun, not trying to kill but to create chaos, to give Tommy the opening he needed. The blast echoed through the chamber like thunder. Tommy broke free and reached the support beam, his explosive device ready. But as he knelt to plant it, Sarah grabbed his arm. Please don't, she said, and for a moment she sounded like herself again. They're not monsters. They're just different. They're trying to save us. From what? Sarah looked around at the chamber, at the organic walls, at the transformed figures who'd once been human. From dying alone, she whispered. From being forgotten. Down here, we're all together. Forever. Tommy stared at her, and June saw something break inside him. The college kid facade, the desperate attempt to be brave, all of it crumbled, leaving only a terrified young man who'd lost everything that mattered. I want to see my father, he said quietly. Marcus smiled. Of course, he's been waiting for you. From the shadows stepped a figure June recognized from the old photos. Pete Garrison Sr., Tommy's father. He looked exactly as he had the day he'd disappeared in 1989, except for the eyes. Those glowed with the same inner light as all the others. Hello, son, he said. I've been waiting so long. Tommy dropped the explosive device and walked toward his father like a man in a trance. June lunged for the device, but Elena blocked her path. Don't, Elena said, her transformed eyes pleading. Let us be together. Let us be a family again. June looked around the chamber and realized they were surrounded. Frank stood with his back to the support beam, the empty shotgun useless in his hands. Pete lay unconscious on the stone floor, overcome by his injuries and the stress of the past few days. Diane knelt beside him, no longer fighting, no longer resisting. They'd lost, But June had spent her career in situations where people died, where medicine failed, where hope seemed impossible. And she'd learned something in all those years. Sometimes the only victory was making sure the problem stopped with you. She pulled out her emergency medical kit and removed a small vial, potassium chloride, used for cardiac procedures. In the right dose, it stopped the heart instantly. In the wrong dose, it also stopped the heart instantly. "June," Marcus said, noticing what she was doing, "there's no need for that. You can be with your uncle again. You can be part of something beautiful." June looked at her Uncle David, at the thing that wore his face and spoke with his voice. For a moment, she was 12 years old again, listening to him tell stories around a campfire in these same woods. "I loved you," she said quietly, "but I won't become you." She injected the potassium chloride into her IV port, a habit from years of trauma work, always having ready access for emergencies. Her heart stopped, but in the moment before darkness took her, she saw Tommy's face change, saw him remember who he was supposed to be. He grabbed the explosive device and threw himself at the support beam. The blast, when it came, was louder than thunder. Day 7. Dawn June woke up dead. That was her first thought as consciousness returned. Clinical, professional, matter of fact. She'd injected a lethal dose of potassium chloride directly into her bloodstream. Her heart had stopped. She should be dead. Instead, she was lying on cold stone in absolute darkness, her body aching but functional. When she tried to sit up, every muscle screamed in protest. "You're awake," said a familiar voice. Elena, but different somehow. When June's eyes adjusted, she could see her companion sitting nearby, her skin pale as moonlight, her eyes reflecting what little light filtered through cracks in the stone above them. "Where are we?" "About 50 feet down from where the tunnel collapsed," Elena said. "The explosion brought down most of the main chamber. We're lucky to be alive." June checked her pulse, steady, if slow. "I should be dead." "You were, for about 3 minutes, then you came back." Elena's voice carried a strange mixture of sadness and wonder. "They say that happens sometimes down here. Death doesn't take the same way." June looked around what she now realized was a small air pocket in the collapsed tunnel. Light filtered through gaps in the rubble, suggesting they weren't completely buried. "The others?" "Frank's over there." Elena pointed to a figure lying motionless against the far wall. "Still breathing, but he hasn't woken up." "Tommy," she paused. Tommy didn't make it out of the main chamber. The memory came flooding back. Tommy grabbing the explosive device, throwing himself at the support beam, the blast that had brought down 60 years of mining infrastructure in a cascade of stone and timber. "Did it work?" June asked. "Did we stop them?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I think so. I can't hear the voices anymore. The walls aren't alive the way they were before." June struggled to her feet, testing her mobility. "Bruised, battered, but functional. We need to get out of here. Find help." "June," Elena said quietly, "look at your hands." June held up her hands in the dim light filtering through the rubble. Her skin had a translucent quality, and when she looked closely, she could see dark veins running beneath the surface, not blood vessels, but something else, something that pulsed with its own rhythm. "We were exposed," Elena explained. "Whatever was in that chamber, whatever had infected them all, we breathed it in, absorbed it through our skin. We're changing." June forced herself to remain calm, to think like a medical professional. "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Hours? Days? I can feel it working in my bloodstream. It's not unpleasant, like a fever breaking." Through the gaps in the rubble, June could hear sounds from the surface. Engines, voices, the organized chaos of a rescue operation. Someone had noticed the explosion, sent help. "We can't let them find us like this," June realized. "If we're infected, if we're carrying whatever transformed the others." Elena nodded. "We could spread it, start the whole cycle over again." They sat in silence, contemplating their situation. Above them, the rescue sounds grew louder. Heavy machinery, probably trying to clear the tunnel entrance. "There's another way out," Elena said eventually. "A smaller passage that connects to the old drainage system. I explored it while you were unconscious. It leads to a natural cave about half a mile from here." June considered their options. They could wait for rescue, risk spreading the infection to their rescuers and potentially starting a new outbreak. Or they could disappear, vanish into the forest, and hope the transformation process killed them before they became a threat to others. "What happened to the others?" she asked. "The ones who were transformed?" Elena gestured to the collapsed chamber above them. "Buried. All of them. Marcus, my father, your uncle, everyone. Tommy's explosion brought down the entire support structure. Nothing could have survived that. June felt a mixture of grief and relief. Her uncle was finally at rest, no longer twisted into something that served the mountain's hunger. But the cost. We should go, she said finally. Find that drainage tunnel. Get as far from here as possible. They gathered what supplies they could from the debris. Water bottles, a flashlight with dying batteries, Elena's copy of Into the Wild. Frank remained unconscious but breathing. June checked his pulse and pupils, found signs of severe concussion but no immediately life-threatening injuries. We can't carry him, Elena said. June looked at Frank, thinking about medical ethics, about triage decisions, about the greater good versus individual lives. He's not infected. Look at his skin, normal color, normal temperature. Whatever protected him from the transformation might save him, or he might die down here in the dark. June found Frank's military dog tags and checked his information. He's got family, wife, kids, according to his emergency contact information. They'll never stop looking for him. She positioned Frank as comfortably as possible near one of the larger air gaps, where rescuers were most likely to find him. Left him water and a note explaining that 2 survivors had gone for help through a secondary exit. Ready? Elena asked. June took one last look at Frank, at the collapsed chamber that had claimed Tommy, his life, at the rubble that buried decades of horror and transformation. Ready. The drainage tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for one person at a time. They crawled through limestone passages carved by centuries of water flow, following the sound of running water toward daylight. June's hands looked worse now, the dark veins more prominent, the translucent quality spreading up her arms. Elena was changing too, her movements becoming more fluid, her eyes reflecting light like an animal's. How do you feel? June asked during one of their rest stops. Different, Elena admitted. Hungry, but not for food. It's like I'm craving something I don't have a name for. June understood. She felt it too, a gnawing emptiness that seemed to center in her bones, a need that conventional sustenance couldn't satisfy. We can't go back to civilization. Not like this. I know. They emerged from the cave system as the sun was setting on their 7th day in the forest. The rescue operation was visible in the distance, helicopters, emergency vehicles. Search teams combing through the area around the collapsed mine entrance. June and Elena crouched in the undergrowth, watching the organized chaos of the search and rescue effort. They were close enough to hear radio chatter, to see the faces of the rescuers, to call out for help. Instead, they turned away and walked deeper into the forest. They found Route 103 after an hour of hiking. The cracked asphalt looked exactly as June remembered it from her arrival 6 days ago. Yellow lines faded to ghosts, pine trees pressing close on both sides. But something was different now, something she couldn't quite name. There, Elena said, pointing to a stone marker beside the road. I think that's new. June approached the marker, her transformed vision allowing her to read the carved inscription, clearly despite the gathering darkness, in memory of those who didn't die. They were taken back. Below the inscription, 7 names were listed, and David Talbot, 1989, and Robert Reeves, 1989, and Stanley Kozlowski, 1989, and Pete Garrison, SR 1989, and Chen Wei Ming, 1989, Marcus Webb, 2005, Thomas Garrison Jr., 2005. Marcus wasn't just helping them, June realized. He was one of them. Had been from the beginning. Elena touched her father's name, her translucent fingers tracing the carved letters. They're all at rest now. Finally, June pulled out her wallet to check her driver's license, wanting to confirm her own identity before the transformation progressed further. But when she looked at the ID, the name was fading, literally disappearing from the plastic as she watched. Elena checked her own identification with the same result. The forest is erasing us, she said with strange calm. We're becoming part of it. They walked along Route 103 as darkness fell completely, their eyes adjusting to provide perfect night vision. The hunger was getting stronger now, but it wasn't a craving for conventional food. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a need to return to the earth, to become part of the greater ecosystem they'd glimpsed in the mine. Where do we go now? Elena asked. June looked back toward the distant lights of the rescue operation, then ahead down the dark ribbon of asphalt that stretched into the forest, away from people, far away. And then, June thought about her career as a trauma nurse, about all the lives she'd saved, all the families she'd helped heal. That person was fading along with her name on her driver's license, but the core remained, the need to protect others, to prevent suffering. Then we make sure this ends with us, she said. We find somewhere remote, and we wait for the transformation to complete. And when it does, we don't follow in their footsteps. Elena nodded, understanding. We break the cycle. They began walking north on Route 103, leaving the rescue lights behind them. June's medical bag felt lighter with each step, as if the instruments inside were becoming less solid, less real. By morning, she suspected, there would be nothing left but two figures walking deeper, into the New Hampshire wilderness, carrying the infection away from civilization. Behind them, the rescue teams would eventually find Frank alive in the collapsed tunnel. He would tell his story to investigators who would classify it as trauma-induced hallucination, the result of being trapped underground for days with insufficient oxygen. The official report would blame the explosion on unstable mining infrastructure, a delayed collapse from decades-old excavation work. The 7 people who had signed up for Marcus Webb's wilderness survival course would be listed as missing, presumed dead. Their families would grieve. Eventually they would move on, and Route 103 would return to its reputation as just another dangerous stretch of mountain highway where accidents happened for no apparent reason. October 2006, 1 year later, Park Ranger Lisa Santos was conducting her monthly survey of the abandoned mining area when she found the memorial stone. It sat beside Route 103, looking like it had been there for years, despite her certainty that the roadside had been empty during her previous patrol. The inscription was weathered but readable, in memory of those who didn't die. They were taken back. Below it, 7 names were carved in stone that looked far older than the dates suggested. Lisa made a note in her report and photographed the marker, planning to research its origins when she returned to the ranger station. But somehow, she never got around to it. The photo came out blurry despite the perfect lighting conditions, and her notes became increasingly illegible each time she tried to transcribe them. The forest, it seemed, preferred to keep some secrets. Late that night, 2 figures emerged from the deep woods and stood beside the memorial. They moved with fluid grace, their pale skin luminescent in the moonlight. Where they walked, mushrooms sprouted in perfect circles, and the trees leaned inward as if drawn by their presence. June Talbot, or what had once been June Talbot, read the names on the stone with eyes that reflected starlight. The transformation was complete now. She no longer needed food or water or shelter. The forest itself sustained her, just as she nourished it in return. Elena joined her, carrying a bouquet of flowers that grew only in the deepest caves, their petals glowing with bioluminescent light. They placed the offering at the base of the memorial, not for the dead, but for the living they had chosen to leave behind. "Any regrets?" Elena asked, her voice like wine through pine needles. June considered the question. She thought about the hospital where she'd worked, the patients she'd saved, the normal life she'd abandoned. Then she thought about the alternative, spreading the infection, starting new cycles of transformation, bringing more families to suffer what theirs had endured. "No," she said finally, "this is better." They turned away from the memorial and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees like mist. Behind them, the stone marker began to sink slowly into the earth, pulled down by roots and time, and the mountain's patient appetite for secrets. By morning, only a slight depression in the ground would mark where it had stood. By next month, even that would be gone, overgrown with ferns and moss, and the endless green forgiveness of the New Hampshire wilderness. Route 103 stretched empty in both directions, carrying its traffic of ordinary travelers who never noticed the shadow movements at the forest's edge, or the way certain sections of road seemed to whisper their names in the wind. The debt had been paid, the cycle was broken, and deep in the woods, where no human foot would ever walk again, 2 guardians kept watch over secrets that were better left buried, ensuring that some hungers stayed forever unsatisfied, some doors remained permanently sealed, and some debts were never allowed to compound interest across the generations. The forest had its protectors now, and they would make sure it never needed to feed again.